They managed to hack into their entire network, and they were holding it hostage. I mean, this could have been a life or death situation. They wanted a ransom. They wanted money in return for releasing control back to the hospital for their own network. So when we're talking about a network switch, are there ways to secure it to keep people from accessing its settings and its configuration? And really, they could have prevented the hijacking of their entire network by just doing this one thing. And the one thing is... Hey, I'm Clint Garrett, Ace Networker, and I want to get into talking about how to set up passwords on a layer 2 switch on your network. You need to be able to secure your switch so that somebody can't remotely log in or even log in using the console, if you don't want them to, on site when they're there physically. So how do you do this? How do you set up passwords and logins? And what are the different levels that are associated with those logins? And before this video is up, I'm going to tell you about how a hospital had their entire network hijacked and taken over because of this one thing right here. Passwords, logins on a switch. There are two levels of passwords, really, that we are wanting to look at when it comes to a layer 2 switch. And really this kind of pertains to routers as well. It pertains to a lot of networking devices. But we're really primarily looking at switches because we're looking at LAN devices, and a switch is the central connectivity device on a local area network. So when you get your switch secured and you understand how to secure that switch, you also understand how to secure a router and other components that are on your network. Console access, which is direct physical access to the switch, where you're connecting to it directly, and you have remote access. So there are two layers really to passwords on a layer 2 switch or router. One is for console access, when you're there physically and you're connected to the console port and you're trying to log into the switch to change the configuration, look at the configuration. If you remember from previous videos, or you may already know this because my viewers are extremely intelligent anyway, that's a given. I already know that about you. When you first set up a layer 2 switch, you have to power it on and connect to it directly using the console port with a serial cable or a USB to RJ45 adapter like this one. You have to connect to the switch to make any changes to the basic startup configuration that comes installed on it from the factory. You will use a command line emulator program like PuTTY or TerraTerm or HyperTerminal. Again, there are several out there and most are free for download and use. Once you get the settings for the connection correct and you power the switch on, it will go through its startup process, its post, power on self-test. And again, check out other videos where we go into detail with this process when a switch starts up. But once it goes into, after it gets done with its post, it will come up to the, what they sometimes call user mode or privileged exec mode. And the privileged exec mode prompt looks like this. From the privileged exec mode prompt, you will enter... Now, let me make a side note here. When I first got into networking, I had a hard time understanding all of the different passwords needed on a layer 2 switch, and I was scared that if I didn't set them up correctly, I could leave a company's network open to infiltration. And over the years of my experience, I had a good reason to be scared about it. This is where security begins to take place. These are some of the first steps you take in security. I knew passwords and logins worked a certain way on Cisco switches and routers, but they may not be the same on other brands of switches and routers like Juniper, Dell, HP, and the list goes on and on and on. There are a lot of manufacturers out there. Check your documentation on the brand and the model of the switch you're using this on. That's always my best recommendation. So I'm going to resolve that by looking at passwords from the standpoint of a Cisco switch here, but we're going to look at passwords from a functionality standpoint to help you grasp how they work on different brands of layer 2 switches. The configuration steps may be different, the commands may even be different from manufacturer to manufacturer, but the concept of setting them up is the same across the board. So from the privileged exec mode prompt, as you see here, you will type in enable and press the enter key to get to enable mode. Once you're in enable mode, you will then type in configure terminal and hit the enter key to get to configuration mode. Now at this point there are two different password levels you can set up on this switch to prevent access to someone getting into enable mode or configuration mode, like we are here, where we can make actual changes to the configuration running on the switch. The first is the basic enable password, which is just a password required to be entered when trying to get into enable mode. So in other words, when we type the word enable and we hit enter, if there is an enable password there, it's going to prompt you for that password. We'll get into that in just a second. To set the basic enable mode password, you will type in enable password. Again, make sure you're in configuration mode. This is where you actually make changes, set passwords, make any configuration changes to the switch. You will enter enable password, followed by whatever password you want to enter here. We've got the word password in the brackets here, but you actually want to put, instead of password in brackets, you want to put the password you want to use here. So you'll type in enable password lightsaber. I'm going to use that as an example password in just a second. Now let me stop right here by saying the basic enable password is always recommended, but it is by no means a serious level of security on a switch or router. Why? Because if we only set an enable password in configuration mode like we are here, and we left it, if someone not authorized to be in the data center with your switches and routers were to connect to the switch using the console cable like we are here, and if they had a way of seeing the listed out configuration on this switch, the enable password would be displayed in the running configuration in clear text. So if they were able to see a running listing configuration on the switch, it would be listed in clear text, so they would know exactly what that password is. So it's recommended you set the enable password, the enable mode password with the enable password, followed by whatever you want that password to be, and hit enter. But you want to take it to the next step. The next step is the enable secret password. The enable secret password is not technically encrypted per se, but if once you set an enable secret password, it shows in the running configuration, it's listed as an encrypted kind of jumbled bunch of letters and numbers that are not clear text. So if someone that's not authorized to connect to the console of this switch does manage to physically connect to the console, or they actually see the running configuration, or they do somehow do a show running config, they won't be able to see the enable password listed in clear text because it will list the enable password as secret, and it will be encrypted kind of in a way that it displays in the running configuration. Once you're in configuration mode like we are here, you can type in enable secret followed by whatever secret password you want to use. In this example, I'm creating an enable secret password of lightsaber. So if we entered typed in the words enable secret lightsaber, you would create a password in the enable mode, in secret mode, called lightsaber. If you were to do a show running config command from enable mode, you would see the running configuration, but you would see enable secret followed by a bunch of letters and numbers that were kind of jumbled. It would not show lightsaber, even though that's actually what it is. And this is what would show up in the running config instead of a clear text version of the basic enable password. Again, the basic enable password will be shown, and it will show you exactly what that is in the running configuration. Professionals always recommend you set both an enable password and an enable secret password, as the enable secret password will always override the basic enable password, even though you've created both on the switch. Now, the enable password or passwords are only scratching the surface for passwords and security on a layer 2 switch. Now we're getting to the nitty-gritty of switch security. So there are two types of connections, if you will, as I mentioned before, for accessing switch settings and configuration. The first is what we're using here in this kind of picture here that I'm showing you, and that's console access, like we're doing in this example, where we're physically present next to the physical switch to connect to it using the console cable and its actual physical console port. And then the second method is remote access, where we connect to it remotely over a network or even from outside the network. The first major level of security you want to place on a layer 2 switch like this one is the username and password that are used on the console connection. And if you don't do a username and password, you can do just a password. But the console connection is the first level of security that you want to configure a password on. Theoretically, on this example I'm showing you here, there was yet no console username and password configured, so we were able to connect to the console using a console cable here with this laptop and get access to all the settings on the switch because no passwords have been set up for the console connection. This may be how a switch would come basically configured from the factory or the manufacturer when you bought it brand new. If they establish a username and password from the factory or the manufacturer, you would be prompted when you first open your hyperterminal, TerraTerm, or PuTTY command line interface software or your app and you try to connect to the switch. And they should tell you that, they should tell you what that username and password are, or they should have it in the documentation for you to use for first-time setup if they have established one already on the switch. But in most cases, they do not have any passwords or usernames established. Now, I can tell you this, there for a while, and you may still yet see this out there, the default username and password were admin for the username and just the word password for the password. That was the default that came from the factory on a lot of different devices, even on Cisco's. But in this case here that I'm using on the screen, in this case, there was initially no username and password set up for console access, so we were not prompted, and we could get right in and view or change settings and configuration. So to set a password for console access going forward, you would again type the word enable followed by the enter key at the privileged exec or user mode, greater than prompt. Then you would enter configuration mode with the configure terminal command, followed by the enter key. This would put you into configuration mode, where you are now able to set or change configuration settings on the switch once more. Here you would type line console 0 to take you into the configuration settings for the console port access on this switch. Line console 0, followed by enter. You would then type console password, my console password, or whatever word you want to use for your password here. In this case, we're using my console password as your password. And then you would hit enter. Then, and this is very important, on most brands of switch and router, you type login to actually activate the prompt for the password on this console port when someone connects to it. If you created the console line password with the previous command and didn't enter the word login followed by the enter key, you would have established a password but no prompt to enter the password for access. So creating the password does absolutely nothing. You have to type in login to activate the password on this console port line to have it prompt for the password to allow access. Now this can get a little bit tricky. Sometimes if you don't establish a password on the console line, in other words, if you just came into the configuration for line console 0 and just typed in the word login and hit enter, you would be asking the switch to prompt for a password, but there's no password set. So essentially you're just kind of locking the console line out. Now on some of the later versions of Cisco iOS, it will not allow you to do this. You cannot type in login to activate the password on the console or the VTY lines that we're going to get to later without first having established a password. It won't let you do that because of the fact that it was locking people out. It's just a new feature. So now once we've established this password on the console port access, from then on going forward, when we try to connect to the console and we end up at try to get the switch prompt or we hit enter, it's going to prompt you for a password, and you have to put my console password or whatever the actual password is for the console access in order to get back to the privileged exec mode, the greater than prompt for the switch. Otherwise it will not allow you access, at least through this console connection. This is the first connection that we're talking about here. The second method is when you connect to it remotely, and this is usually over what they call VTY line access. So these are any kind of remote access to the switch when you have assigned an IP address to it for management on your network, and you're accessing it remotely. Now, remotely could be through a secondary switch connected to that, through a router going out to the internet. It could be from another desktop device on the network that's connected to it. There are multiple ways to connect remotely and multiple locations and connectivity points to connect remotely, but those are always done via a VTY line access, which is remote access on the switch. So you have console access, which is direct physical access to the switch, where you're connecting to it directly, and you have remote access. So we just went through console access using the console port on the switch, the physical console port, which is when you're physically next to the switch and can use the console cable and the console port. Now we're going to look at creating a password or passwords on the VTY lines, the remote access lines. These are used to log into the switch and set or change configuration settings remotely. Again, another side note here, this is not across the board, but most switch and router manufacturers will create 5 VTY lines, remote access lines, on a switch or a router. You may see as many as sometimes 0 through 15 VTY lines, but you'll have, on most switches that have 5, you'll have VTY line 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Those are the 5 VTY lines. These are used for remote access or login with one of 3 methods: Telnet, SSH, or via a graphical user interface, a GUI, using a browser. This is where the switch settings are displayed on a web page in your browser, and the switch manufacturer allows that web page to be set up with the settings and configurations on the switch or the router itself so that they are displayed whenever you access it using a browser instead of a command line interface app. We'll get more into detail on these methods in other videos, but for now, just know that on most brands of switches and routers, there are typically 5 VTY remote access lines that can be used. You can also set up a password on these that prompts and requires entry to these remote lines to be accessible. You can create a single password for use on all VTY lines. I'm going to show you the commands that we use to just set up all VTY lines together as a range of interfaces, which is not really ever recommended, but we're going to do that for the sake of keeping it short here. Or you can create a different password on each VTY line independently. The commands for creating passwords and requiring password prompts on each VTY line are as follows. You would go into enable mode, go into configure terminal, and from configuration mode, you would go into the configuration for the VTY lines. Now, to get them all as a range, you could type line VTY 04 or 015, or depending on how many VTY lines you have on the switch. Once you hit enter, you're in the config-line. You're now configuring those VTY lines. So to set one password for this range of VTY lines, like we're doing in this example, we're doing VTY lines 0 through 4, all of them as a range, all at the same time. We're setting the same password on all of them. We're going to type in password space my VTY password, where my VTY password is the password that's going to be set on all of those lines. We hit enter. And then we do as we did on the console. We type in the word login and hit enter to activate that password prompt on all of those VTY lines. Now, you can get into routers. Some of the actual login and configuration processes are exactly the same on a router, on a layer 3 router. But we want to come at this primarily from the standpoint of a layer 2 switch so that you can kind of get a better grasp and understanding of not only how switches work, but also how routers work as you begin to apply some of these same settings, configurations, passwords, logins to them. So this brings me back to the hospital. I won't name names. All of that is still secure information, and it's nobody's business. But I can give you some of the generalities of it. An entire hospital, a medical hospital, was taken hostage. Their network was taken hostage because of this one security flaw right here. They had a network technician that was on site, and they had just ordered a brand new switch. This technician didn't set up any passwords or security on this switch and just simply connected it and loaded up a configuration that did not have any security passwords required to access it. And it was from this one switch they were able to hack into and get access to enough of the network to begin to hold it hostage and reset some devices and change their configurations as they spread out. Now, it just so happens that they had a lot of wireless access points connected to this one specific switch that was being replaced. And because these access points were connected directly to this switch, it was no problem for them to be able to connect into the console remotely, log into the switch because there were no passwords, and begin accessing the switch and changing its configurations with its connectivity to other devices on that network. And from there, it just began to branch out. They just slowly but surely got access to the entire network, and they were able to take over enough components on that network to actually hold it hostage. They left them running, but they also wanted money in exchange for allowing that network to be set free. So without them shutting down the entire network and possibly risking lives and safety and everything else, information, data, everything else that went along with that network, they had to try at first negotiating with this hostile group that was trying to take over their network and hold it hostage. And really, they could have prevented the hijacking of their entire network by just doing this one thing. And the one thing is making sure that when they installed a switch, they had passwords on it. So you don't want to get into those scenarios. What you want to do is you always want to be mindful of security and methods of hacking into a network whenever you get into networking. And that's always advisable. It doesn't matter how far into the realm of security you go, you always want to have security in mind. So we're going to get more into security as I make more videos on computer networking. Security is a big facet of maintaining the health and safety and functionality of a computer network. It doesn't matter what size it is. You don't want outsiders that are not authorized being able to get into your network and especially change settings and configurations on switches and routers. So be watching, because I'm going to be creating some more videos as we go along here shortly about more about security and securing your network. We're going to get into more aspects of security as we go along, but while we're talking about layer 2 switches, it's very important, very, very important that you keep this in mind. Passwords and logins are the key, and you always want to be mindful of those and always make sure that not only do you know what they are, but you have them set up to prevent unauthorized people from accessing those devices and changing their settings.